prepare any speech the agency has my
You may not get it.
So I'm just here talking on
Basically all of them. It's not.
So, we make sure the deal is great. She's good.
Staff there right and tear down this wall. Oh, cool. He's right. He's always one of us that comes out and helps the
New projects or just stuff like?
That's all good. Somebody's got to jumpstart the economy.
So is this, do I have to switch it off?
Nope, I'll do it that. Sorry, I got it locked on so that you don't help out in any way. Hey, I'd like to you step up to the front just a second.
Good evening. My name is Robert Tomes, and I'm on the Board of Directors for the Council for Emerging National Security Affairs. We're going to get started. The official party is going to come in and take their seats. If you would please turn your cell phones and PDAs off or turn them to stun. We are recording the event, and we would appreciate it if you would do that. Before we get started, it'll be my pleasure to introduce Dean Montgomery. I wanted to say a little bit about Sensa. We're very happy to be here. This is actually 10 years almost to the day after we had our first engagement with Georgetown. We used to teach a seminar on counterterrorism at the School of Foreign Service, and we did that for 3 years, I think 2000, 2001, and 2002. And so this is very exciting for us because we've always enjoyed and remember that time with Georgetown, and we're very happy to be here tonight. After the event tonight, we're going to have a reception with some heavy hors d'oeuvres, so don't run out to eat because we bought food for you, and we would like you to stay around and participate in the reception. And as the official party, go ahead and get seated. If you want to come on in, that's fine. The Council for Emerging National Security Affairs was started 10 years ago, specifically for mid-career national security professionals. We have chapters in Washington, D.C., New York, London, Monterey, and we do several events, a teleconference series that's been focused on Afghanistan, and this is our leadership series. Tonight, the speaker is in good company. In addition to tonight's event, we hold events in Old Town, and you're welcome to sign up to be able to get on the invite list. Our upcoming speakers will be General Scowcroft and Undersecretary of Defense Michael Vickers. In the past, we've had Michelle Flournoy, we've had Michael Hayden, John Noggle, and what we try to do with our leadership series is find a small venue. We don't always get a great library like this for our events. But we try to find an intimate gathering where we can have a speaker really talk off the record, although I believe tonight is on the record and is being filmed. And we welcome your questions at the end. So it's my pleasure to introduce Dean Edward Montgomery, who's in his second year as the Dean of the Georgetown Public Policy Institute. We share a common past because he was the Dean of the College of Behavioral and Social Sciences at the University of Maryland when I was doing my PhD there. He's an economist by training, and I'm a political scientist by training, so that means in our disciplines we steal from each other and don't admit it. He's also held several senior government appointments and positions, including on President Obama's Auto Task Force, and he's served in other institutions in addition to Georgetown University of Maryland, including Carnegie Mellon and Michigan State. And he will help introduce our speaker tonight. So, Dean Montgomery.
It's a pleasure to be here tonight, and I do want to thank Sensa for hosting and helping to organize this event. Really is a great opportunity for us at the Public Policy School to hear from a man who's spent his life in public service, who has been the personification of an effective leader in a variety of positions throughout that time. And so we're really honored to have him. We want to thank Michael Finzel, and of course we have to give a shout out to Dave Buffalo, one of our own alums, for helping putting together this event. General McCaffrey is really an exceptional public servant. He has had, if he only had his military career, it would be awe-inspiring. He spent 32 years in the Army as a Ranger. He retired as a four-star general. He received the Distinguished Service Cross twice. He received 3 Purple Hearts, 2 Silver Stars, an absolutely amazing record that was recognized in 2007 by his induction in the U.S. Ranger Hall of Fame. But he didn't stop there. After his military service, and having served in Desert Storm, he became the director of the White House Office of National Drug Control Policy, the Drug Czar, where he served for 5 years. And that was a distinguished record. But he hasn't stopped there. He's continued to be active today and is a member of the Council of Foreign Relations. He's on the board of numerous different private organizations and good public charities. And he's been recognized by really an incredible array. He's been recognized by the CIA. He's been recognized by the Coast Guard. He's been recognized by the State Department. But he's also been recognized by HHS. He's been recognized by Harvard Medical School. He's been recognized by the NAACP. There are not many people who have that kind of portfolio, that kind of breadth of distinction. And all of those awards were forms of lifetime achievements. So it's really the breadth of his career. He's received a master's in government from American University. He has the distinction of not only having gone to West Point, but then got to turn around and teach at West Point, where he was a distinguished faculty member. So throughout his career, he has always risen to leadership positions. We're honored to hear from him today. There's no better speaker to tell us about leadership than General McCaffrey. Thank you.
Thanks, Ed. We sound on, and probably not needed except for the camera up there. You know, my standard response every time I'm introduced, and it's sort of the setup, obviously, is to say that that was the second best introduction I ever got. And then I follow it with a true story that some in the audience will identify with. I go out to Leavenworth almost every year, and I do a lecture on combat leadership. A lot of fun. Huge audience, 1,000 Chinese majors all sitting there, bored to death. You know, the atmosphere in the room is, go ahead, entertain me if you can. And the custom is that some student has to introduce the guest speaker. Pretty intimidating. All your buddies out there, you got to say something nice about the old boy. And the first year I gave that, I just left the Clinton administration. I was a civilian. And my son was a student, and they said, you have to introduce your dad. Oh, my God. He sniveled, he cried, he tried to get out of it. He called me, and I said, shut up and do what you were told. So he stumbles out on stage, and he painfully reads every word in my long biography, at the end of which he says, however, he said, I want you to know that I have worked for this great man for more than 21 years. Primarily in the areas of lawn and automotive maintenance. Well, it's a great pleasure to be here, and I thank Sensa and Georgetown University for the invitation to speak. Sensa's program. Boy, that's pretty attractive. I'd love to go listen to Brent Scowcroft again. He's one of my heroes. What a great man he's been.
I'll send you an invite, sir.
Yeah. He came over with President George Bush Thanksgiving Day, just prior to the operation on Desert Storm. And they actually hauled along the majority-minority Senate, House, the president, I think the vice president was still back in the States, and Brent was, of course, chief staff, or national security advisor. I've never forgotten this. The president made 3 stops during that visit. Essentially, one was air power, one was Army units, and the final one was Navy Marine elements out in the east. And so I trucked in, there were probably 3,000 soldiers sitting out there in a giant natural sand amphitheater, and the president gets up, and he's one of my heroes, Bush 41, make sure you get the right Bush in your mind. He stands up there and he says, you know, he said, I was commander of the 24th Infantry Division, which during World War II fought in the Pacific Theater. Principal combat action, several months fighting in the Philippines. So President Bush gets up there and he says, you know, he said, in 1944, I was flying off the carrier San Jacinto. It was my 5th to last mission of the Pacific Campaign, and it was a ground support mission for the 24th Infantry Division. And all of us went, oh my God. Everybody got tears welled up in their eyes. What a magnificent public servant. I'm not sure he was a great politician, but his life was remarkable. And Brent Scowcroft, of course, the same kind of guy. There's a bunch of them that have appeared like that, Colin Powell and others. Hey, who is the engineering undergraduate student about to take the GREs? It's a good opportunity to tell one of my favorite stories. I spent a lot of part of the last 10 years on the board of directors of H&TB Engineering. And so I do a lot of work on U.S. national infrastructure, bridges, roads, airports, seaports, that sort of thing. Testify to state legislatures. And I always warn the engineers to be humble in there, to control their egos. They're all very bright, industrious guys. And told them about I went back up to teach at West Point as a captain, like 25 years old, and I report in, and the department executive officer, social science, I was going to teach comparative politics and economics and national security, that sort of thing. The department executive officer is a friend of mine, 2 years my senior, Jim Ellis. Some of you may remember him, retired as a 3-star, wonderful man, Alabama, deep southern accent. And behind his desk, he had a saber from the Department of Mathematics as the brightest math student, plus or minus several years. He's very proud of this. So I reported, and he says, you, as an additional duty, are going to be in charge of HR. So you're going to recruit, get into graduate school, and bring back here to teach young officers. That's great. I had 70-some-odd dossiers in my possession of the current occupants, and then would reach out and try and find people 4 years out. My screening tool, since we were primarily economics, political science, were the GRE scores. Remember 800s max? Same with the college SATs, quantitative, verbal. Now I think they've got a writing test in there also. My screening tool would probably be something like this. Verbal, 735. I'd want a very high score. And quantitative, you'd have to be pretty high. You couldn't do quantitative analysis, so maybe 680, okay? Couple of numbers. I'm sitting there one day going through the file folders of the guys in the department. I get to Jim Ellis's, and it's quantitative 800, which you rarely see, verbal 309. And I went into his office and said, for God's sakes, Jim, how in the heck did you get into this department? He said, Barry says, it's been a problem my entire life. I was the first one that knew the answer, and I couldn't tell nobody. With your permission, let me walk through some ideas, many of which are, you know, human psychology 101. You've heard them before, and perhaps we can use them as a framework to discuss leadership. And leadership, by the way, from my perspective, I've had, formal training and education and 32 years in military in charge of people and complex events, and a cabinet officer, and now in business on boards of directors of publicly held firms and privately held firms and nonprofits, and lots of interaction with the government, how our government works, Congress, the media, constituencies. So I've seen, leadership from different perspectives, and perhaps we can talk about it in that context. Somebody's going to skip through slides for me. Thanks, Paul. And want them to start with, how come people are going to do what you ask them to do, particularly if it's not steady state. If there's 1,000 branch offices and a 20-person corporate headquarters and it's all procedural, that's one thing. But what if it's emergency action? What if it's a company or an element that's having troubles? Why would the people do what I ask them to do? And assertion number one, no kidding, is because you are the COO, the CEO, the school district superintendent, the dean of the school, the battalion commander, that's why they're going to do what you're telling them. And by the way, along with that bureaucratic authority comes the power to hire, to fire, to reward, to punish, to set bonuses, to withhold training opportunities. I would argue, and we've certainly seen it in American business over time, that if you didn't have authority power, if there wasn't a structure to what you're trying to do, large organizations simply won't work. If it's 12 genius IQ, Jadu technology, infrared scientists working out of a chicken coop, you can probably pull it together. But over time, large organizations have to have structure. Somebody has to have authority power. However, most of our studies tell us that when you look at high-performing organizations, defined as one that does almost everything pretty good or better, not one that has 9 functional areas, does 2 of them at A+, 1 of them at an F, but a high-performing organization, just about anything you give it, it does well. And by the way, you look at the characteristics of those organizations, sometimes they're not all that fun to be around. Marine battalion, they're suspicious of outsiders, they're insular, they're inward-directed. But one thing we find is, in the leadership, there is lots of expert power. They know what they're doing. When she told us to do it, we said, we've watched her for 2 years, it always comes out right, I guess we ought to do it this time also. There's a corollary to that too, I might add, that if you wish to increase your leadership leverage, you will personally develop yourself and have greater technical competency in what you're supposed to be doing, what your business is up to. And out of that comes not just more informed substantive decisions, but greater leadership credibility. And you can also, by the way, this expert power is granted to you by the organization. They're the ones that look at you and decide to grant you the legitimacy. He or she's an expert at what they're doing. And some of that, by the way, that also implies that the first hour I'm in your organization, it's in trouble, there's an emergency going on, we really don't know who this guy is. There's going to be surrogate measures of expertise. Well, why don't we buy into it? MBA at a Wharton, undergraduate at Georgetown in business, probably knows what he's talking about. The best way, though, to become the acknowledged expert in the organization, have them look at you over time and find that it comes out right when we do what he says. Expert power. Many would argue, the dominant reason why high-performing organizations do well. Finally, this one has great implications for the HR director and the CEO and others who are recruiting talent to put in their management training program. And it says, basically, look, down at the Duke University MBA Leadership Week, and I had a wonderful seminar. I love graduate students who have been out working for a few years, who are paying for their own education. It strips away a lot of the nonsense. And one of the discussion was, you know, what's the secret to life? And, you know, it seems to me there's two secrets. You can almost discount intelligence. There's lots of smart people out there. One major discriminator is, are you willing to work real hard? If you are, you're of tremendous value to us. But the real discriminator on leadership, I would argue, is referent power. When we look at you, do we say, I want to be more like her? It's character, it's integrity. And by the way, the characteristics of referent power can be almost aped from watching other successful leaders. Get up first, go to bed last, be in a freezing motor pool at midnight. When something goes wrong, go there and associate yourself with the problem. Referent power. It's an interesting challenge to organizations because, it's so easy to see it in the military. When you look at the lieutenant, 22 years old, just out of college, we've trained them for a year. They're dealing with, now in modern military, with a unit that's been in combat, 2 or 3 multiple deployments. Your platoon sergeant's an older man or woman of 35. But can you have leadership power in the organization? Of course. You got the authority power. You've been trained for a year, but mostly they look at you and say, what a nice young man from a good family, good character. Let's make it work. Okay, next. Here's another one. When we talk leadership, normally the first thing that comes out is, hey, I'm in charge of this group, and how am I going to get them downward in the hierarchy to do what I want them to do? By the way, one challenge to you as you go through life is figure out who's working for you. Who are you responsible for? Sometimes it's easy. I'm the department head. These are my peeps. This is my machinery. Sometimes it's easy, but a lot of times it isn't. So I tell people, when you get in a new organization, assess who your peer group leadership team is. Who are you trying to influence? So I think the second principal assertion we see, there's the cheapest trick for easily being an effective leader. If you've got 4 subordinate units and they sort of look like one another, you develop objectives, goals, metrics to measure them, and once a day, once a week, once a month, you haul the 4 guys in, sit them in the front row, and you show the comparative metrics. You can color code them, blue, amber, red, and watch them drive each other crazy trying to be competitive. And Americans are very competitive, and that's good. It's healthy. But the other side of that coin is when we see extremely effective organizations, we find that there are strong horizontal linkages in the organization. So they are trying to help each other succeed. They're applauding each other's successes. They're coaching each other and counseling each other on shortcomings. Strong horizontal connections. And so you got to watch it. If you design a competitive organization where everything's cutthroat, you're going to harm that aspect of the organization. And then finally, here's a tough one. You know, I tell people I've seen a couple of people in my life that are nearly perfect, and none of them are in this room. All right, so when you look at the leadership you're going to encounter over your career, mostly you're going to find high levels of energy and expertise, mostly high levels of integrity. But at times, the person in charge is tired, confused, inadequate to the task, scared, has a physical illness, and occasionally gets greedy. Greedy meaning focused on his or her needs as opposed to the organization's. The question arises, have you created a unit, or do you inherit an organization where there's a candid view that we can talk to this more senior leadership in a frank way and an appropriate way? That means two things. There's problems here. Can I pull her aside and say, ma'am, when you put out these instructions, here's the problem it's causing, we need you to reconsider. The other half of that is, can you go in when things are going right and say, your instructions, your example is making this place a better place to work? Now, it's a challenge. Americans are very cautious about, obsequious behavior, cheese-eating behavior, adulation of the boss. But I would argue that in any good organization, you do see vertical feedback up the organization. It's pretty frank and pretty brutal. But by the way, bigger the organization gets, if you have a brain in your head, you start hiring key people who wrestle you for control of the organization and who privately go home each night saying, were it not for me, that stumbling fellow wouldn't be making it. That's what you want around you. A tension in the organization on who's actually in charge. Next. This one's a lot of fun. Now there's Series Z, and in fact, a lot of this is so old it's probably no longer in Psychology 101. But I used to spend a lot of time, somebody in here was in one of my advanced course classes at Fort Benning, and we talk about leadership and say, okay, look, when you look at your organization, it's 100 soldiers, it's 12 scientists and a bench test lab. When you look at them, do you see them as having individual goals that are almost without question incompatible with the goals of the organization? They're trying to maximize their own profit, their own pleasure. They're trying to minimize pain. My challenge as a leader is to devise ways to try and link through reward and punishment your individual behavior to our collective goal. Is that your view of the workforce? Or conversely, say, oh, no, that's not it. That what actually causes people to work real hard is that their pride will link their individual needs to the goals of the organization. And that indeed, extending this kind of argument, that money is reasonably unimportant in the business world, that you have to go out and give them enough money to get them to join your organization. But once you got them in, that it loses its leverage as a motivating factor. Is that how you view the workforce, the troops you're leading? So, I'd go through this elaborate Socratic learning process of lieutenants, but that would just try it in an abbreviated form. Who's a Theory X guy in the room? Come on, there must be one. Good for you. God, see me afterwards. I'm going to recruit you for the Army Rangers. How about Theory Y? What do you think? I mean, basically, mankind, when you walk around among the work carols and you'll see not the pay stub for their Christmas bonus, but instead you'll see they put up a certificate of 15 years loyal service to the organization. Isn't that really what motivates people? Anybody got a different viewpoint? What do you think? Theory X, Theory Y, those are the choices? What do you think? Somebody risk it. Is there a different way of viewing this? Yes, sir.
I believe that both are quite valid, but the problem with Theory X is that once you lose that pain, once the taskmaster leaves, the motivation leaves too.
How about reward? We say, no, your base salary is $1,000 a month, and every time you sell another one of these things, we'll give you 10%. So there's permanent reward built into the system. Now do you feel better about it, Theory X?
I still feel as soon as that goes away, you lose all motivation.
Okay, so that's an attack on Theory X. How about, does this explain, are these your two alternatives, the leader? Risk it. God, what do you think? Is there a different way of looking at it?
Example. Lead by example.
I think the bottom, go ahead. Or maybe you're just adjusting that beautiful hair. What?
It seems hyper-individualized. There's no social aspect to any of this, right? It's I get pain or I have individual
Well, look, what I'd suggest is it's both. Leadership, all leadership is situational. It depends on whether we're in a crisis situation. You know, at one extreme, and this is counterintuitive for most people, if you're a rifle company commander in intense combat, you're giving orders over a radio to people who will listen to it and decide what to do, and it may get them killed in the next 60 seconds. So they'll either do it or not do it, but it'll be completely unrelated to your Theory X reward or punishment. It'll be entirely related to their view of them, their mission, their unit, their buddies, etc. So there's one extreme. We call it the unspoken vote. Nobody attacks in dismounted combat unless they have internalized the ethics, the objectives of the large organization. And by the way, you know, on Theory X, I would love to sort of talk about this one, historical oddity. Your military, the U.S. Armed Forces, fix 1865, the end of that terrible Civil War, better part of 600,000 killed. From 1866 until 2011, the U.S. Armed Forces have suffered another 600,000 killed. How many times have we court-martialed and executed a soldier for misbehavior in the face of the enemy? Executed. The ultimate, by the way, Uniform Code of Military Justice, passed by your Congress. I was a division commander in combat, have immense authority, more so than any federal judge, any governor, the power to indict people, to call for a court-martial, to send them home in shame. How many times have we executed a U.S. soldier since 1866? There's some other militaries, by the way, the Wehrmacht, we don't know, World War II, I'll invent a number, probably in excess of 75,000. The Brits in World War I, at one low end, I think it was 300 or so. The French Army, 1917, Verdun, decimated divisions, bombarded some of them with artillery to punish them because they hadn't fought. How about your armed forces? What was his name? Yeah, a bunch of you in the room know it. It's interesting. It's an interesting story to read, by the way. I took an officer professional development class to the place where his comrades shot him dead in the snow. And, you know, there were 35,000 some odd deserters. The Wehrmacht, the most effective fighting force in history, had come boiling out of the fog in the Battle of the Bulge. A bunch of these, you know, 19-year-old boys had run off and hidden out in the French urban areas. Eisenhower got scared and selected somebody to be shot. This poor little adolescent loser kid who became the one soldier we've ever shot. People don't fight because of reward and punishment. They fight for larger reasons. Okay, next. Here's a challenge to you. You're taking over an organization. You were hired by the board of directors. You were hired by the division commander. You were hired by the school district because something's bad going on. They want you to fix it. And they've listened to various competitors for the job, and they liked your vision. Now you've walked into the organization. Pick the organization in your own mind you want to influence. All change, both good and bad, is resisted with equal intensity. And by the way, taking over a high-performing organization and changing it substantially is immensely difficult. The U.S. Navy, Georgetown University, if they're not screwed up in their own estimation, things have been going right for 200 years. What are you trying to change this thing for? And you're trying to explain new dynamics, demographic, political, economic, you name it, they're going to resist the change. So one of three things is going to happen. The first thing that's going to happen is I'm not going to listen to you. And we all do this. We listen to Fox TV or MSNBC. We read the Washington Times, the Washington Post. We normally won't willingly embrace information that makes us uncomfortable. And when we do hear it, we tend to filter it out. We didn't hear the message. So if you're talking about change, you've got to select the right language sets to link with the values and the past of the organization you're dealing with. I'm not talking about, spinning them, but you have to get language sets that will convince them this is the right thing to do. Second thing that will happen is, well, we worked for Barry for a long time now, a couple, 3 years. He's announced a change. We thought he was pretty sharp. I don't think he's as sharp as we thought he was. They're going to change their view of the messenger. By the way, I run into this in engineering organizations all the time. Modesty is a nice aspect to an organization. But I would suggest if you're in a leadership position, you have a responsibility to sell yourself to your own organization. That ought to be the background. This engineering firm I was with, I'd go into one of our 63 office leaders and there'd be a 4-line bio followed by 17 pages of the bridges I've designed. And I'd start this Q&A with, did you do okay in college? Oh yeah, I was summa cum laude, and the first one in my family to go to college. And how about graduate school? Well, they published my master's thesis, and it was very influential. Are you involved in your community? Of course, I'm in the Rotary and the youth activities and active in my church and choral activities. And you have a responsibility to convince your organization that you're a complex, responsible, talented person. It will increase the likelihood of them accepting the new message. And then finally, I sat through some 8-hour painful day on value propositions in the business world. And basically, what it boiled down to was, look, when you talk to a client, don't tell them what you're up to. Talk about the client's needs and problems and why you think you can solve their problems. That's a value proposition. When you're talking about change, you've got to be talking about not what you're trying to achieve, but what you're trying to achieve in support of your own organization. Otherwise, they're not going to listen to the message. Next. Okay, I always like this one. For God's sakes, the worst thing in the world when nobody thinks they're in charge. You go into a group of 40 employees or 40 soldiers, and you can ask a series of questions. What are you supposed to be doing here? What are you trying to achieve? Who told you to do it? Who are you going to tell when you're completed? How will you know you've achieved your purpose? What are the descriptions of the outcome you're trying to achieve? How much time do you have to get this task done? If there's no answers to those questions, there is nobody in charge. We don't have a plan here. There must be a plan. So I would argue that you must take seriously your responsibility at every level. If you're, of course, there are different appropriate techniques and styles of leadership. There's I was a keynote speaker one year to the American Red Cross. I told them the two great volunteer organizations in the world are the U.S. Armed Forces and the American Red Cross. Quite different leadership techniques are called into play. You got to take charge. You have to have a plan. You need to link rewards to execution. It's astonishing when I tell people, if you treat a company or an organization as a black box, and say, what do you people, what's your output function? How do you measure it? What are your input functions? People, resources, time, whatever. Tell me what your rewards are, reward and punishment system, and I'll tell you what they're doing inside that black box. So design it carefully to make sure that you're getting the behavior that you want. This is another big deal in the age of computers and cell phones and satellite-linked video. It is astonishing what you can do. You can sit in a top-secret rutabaga CNN worldwide global network, and you could watch what's going on at a road junction in Paktika province. And the first thing that will come to your mind is, maybe I can run this whole thing from here. And I would argue it's a huge mistake. You can't do it. So, you know, my sort of guidance to people is figure out who your direct reports are. Figure out who's actually working for you. That's who you're in charge of. Make sure you can see another level below that. That's who you're coaching, mentoring, you're watching resource expenditures, and anything below that, you're not actually running. Someone else is. I think here's another one. There's a great argument. Somebody was just talking about somebody who's been in the job for 30-some odd years. I guess poor Joe Paterno. Once you get satisfied with the performance, your own performance and that of your organizations, you're in trouble. You're about to get run over by history. You can't stay static. The thing changes dramatically over time. Principles don't change. Values don't change. The nature of people and why they act the way they do doesn't change. But if you get satisfied, you're about to find yourself out on a limb. And then I think here's another challenge right there. I've had less success in the civilian world where organizations are so lean. It's amazing to me, the manpower in the U.S. Armed Forces capabilities compared to the civilian business world like night and day. It's fascinating. But the shortcoming, I would argue, in a lot of civilian businesses, you cannot stay where your information is the best. Someone else needs to stay there. Chief Operating Officer, Chief of Staff, Executive Assistant, somebody has to keep the bubble intact, has to listen to all the reports coming in, has to understand it. But if you're in charge, you've got to go where the problems are most intense. Not necessarily to take charge of it, but to associate yourself with the difficult issues as they unravel. And the temptation is, nope, I'm going to stay where I've got access to the metrics day and night, and even worse, I'm going to stay where I can talk to my boss with the greatest facility, instead of saying my fate's actually governed by how the action leaders are doing on the ground. Next. No offense to the MBA model, but you shouldn't ever confuse the numbers with outcomes. You got to figure out, what are we actually trying to do here? What's the broader purpose? And by the way, call it a customer or client. Make sure you know who your real bosses are. Who are you working for? I used to tell people, I'm a drug policy director, I was working for America's mayors, America's county executives, because almost everything that matters in life when it comes to social, medical, job-related, law enforcement takes place at county municipal level. That's where it is. And those, I said, were my customers. Any complicated, hugely complex task, at some point you got to say, what's the outcome? If we got there, how did we do it? And backward plan. And bust it into subcomponents. I frequently see people haven't done that either. But what they're doing is they're working on step one of the complex plan. By the way, most things in life that are tough to deal with have a 15-year time horizon to change things. You know, if you're a company commander, you can, in the Army, in combat, you can change things in 30 minutes. You can move things in different directions. You're running complex organizations, a small aviation business, you got to think in terms of 15 years. Resources, technology, how do you acquire it? How do you train people to run it? How do you maintain it? How do you, at the end of its life cycle, what are you going to do with it? It's 15 years or longer. This wonderful senator I had tremendous respect for, I had a 10-year national drug strategy, and he said, Barry, for God's sakes, you know, even the Soviets only had 5-year plans. Give us a break. And I told him, Senator, you just haven't run large organizations. You're just not used to that. That's the framework. And the same thing here at Georgetown University. I mean, it's literally, these are 15-year programs. You got to look out that far in advance. Here's an odd one to tell organizations. If you do perfect work, you want perfect information. And you're not going to make decisions, and you're not going to frag order, you're not going to give simple warning orders to your subordinates. Here's a new situation developing. You start thinking parallel to my thinking about what we're going to do about it. You can't do perfect work. You've got to get warning orders out and have people start. Human organizations are elastic. Machinery, you turn on the switch and it springs into life. So you have to allow human organization to absorb, to see coming change. This should go without saying. You got to decentralize. You want to hold a person accountable, you have to give them resources, authority, and accountability, supporting the team leaders. And then again, who's actually in charge? Did you hold somebody accountable? Bob Gates, one of my personal heroes. You know, we had probably one of the, he's one of several magnificent people we've had as Secretary of Defense. Leon Panetta is going to be just as good. Bill Perry, the finest person I probably met in public life. Little quiet introvert, math PhD, academic, scholar, created large businesses. We've had a lot of good ones. The contrast between Mr. Rumsfeld and Gates, though, was fascinating to me. You know, who's in charge and how are you going to hold people accountable? Poor Mr. Rumsfeld, brilliant, charismatic, energetic, older, wealthy, experienced, with appalling bad judgment. And in a micromanaged view, intimidated his organization, which is another comment on the organization. And then Gates comes in, and 90 days later, you've got, again, free flow of information and viewpoints and debate and argument, and out of that comes better policy. Next. I always love saying this, you know, leadership. When you're in your 20s, you can get away with anything. You hit your 30s and 40s, a major leadership responsibility is take care of your body. And that means you can't be overweight. This is the single biggest problem in any organization. The stupid stuff is almost always explained by alcohol. Falling out the window, drunk, STDs, starting with material science and ending up with a lesser academic program, sort of bumping your way down the scale. Early pregnancy, unwanted pregnancy, you name it, it's alcohol. And about 6 or 7% of us have an alcohol problem. It means most of us don't. But by the way, sort of a hint to the leadership thing, you're coming up in the organization. If we think you've got an alcohol problem, we'll never trust you. We'll never trust you because we got to call you at 2 o'clock in the morning and get a coherent, responsible answer out of you. Tobacco, exercise, you know, you just got to maintain that. Otherwise, you get overwhelmed. Physically, you can't stand up to pressure. Tobacco, you know, I used to go down to Johns Hopkins, wonderful university, the intramural research lab of NIDA and NIAAAs at Johns Hopkins for HHS. And you know, we had thousands of lab rats down there, little beautiful white lab rats, little pink feet, deet, 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 and they'd be in these cages. And you give a lab rat an option of pushing with his nose on a lever and getting water or methamphetamines, of getting food or an opiate, of getting pushing on a lever and the trap door would go up and there'd be a lady lab rat wearing red lipstick on the other side, or ecstasy as a drug. They'll always choose a drug over another inducement or reward. The only thing you can't get a lab rat to self-administer is cigarette smoke. They're simply not that stupid. As a former smoker, 2 packs a day, I always get away with that. I thought the height of real joy was being under a poncho liner in combat with pouring rain with my first sergeant and I sharing a damp pell-mell cigarette that we'd gotten out of a ration pack with green-gray skin on our hands from smoking. I had the 3-Corps surgeon. I was down talking to I-Corps before they deployed to Iraq one time, got outraged at this one. I told him, "Doctor, that's a floor, not a ceiling." But you know, you can operate for a long time with, essentially with 2 hours of sleep between 2 and 4 in the morning, and then a nice 90-minute nap between 10:30 to 11:30. Everything sort of slows down midday. you're not a lot of fun to deal with. And I tell people you're capable of intermittent bursts of logical behavior. But you can go a long time. You're a little bit better off at 5.5 hours. But the point of this is just if you're in a leadership responsibility, particularly in a crisis situation, you've got to remain. I was just giving a little, coaching session to one of our division commanders deploying into combat again. Said you got to make sure you don't see this as anything but your responsibility to spend 30 minutes reading if it's 2 o'clock in the morning before you go to sleep, to eat 2 meals, to stay clean, to have somebody that helps you stay on track. And by the way, this is a big deal in my mind, And I'm not talking about personal honor so much as collective honor. Can you go back and tell your dad what you did and feel proud about it? And if you can't, don't do it. That's sort of the defining characteristic. And then finally, at the end of the day at retirement, how are you going to be viewed by your own family and by the people in the organization? Are you going to be an example? And by the way, that's how you learn leadership. You either do academic studies or you watch other people's behavior and you say, when I'm in that position, I'm not going to do those following things. Or I'm going to copy the kind of behavior that I saw. A lot of this is passed on, coaching, mentoring. How will you be viewed at the end of your career? I think that's the end, right? No, we got a couple others. We're always thrashing around. Americans are very self-critical. It's a healthy aspect. Nowadays, it sounds like you talk about U.S. prospects, it sounds like we're Guatemala light, for God's sakes, or something. This sort of old data, and I don't know if Stanford University knew what they were doing and they divined this or not. But it is just a comment on, remind yourself periodically, we're the wealthiest society in the history of the world. And it was created from the bottom up. The Constitution, just at University of Washington, we had a reading of the Constitution, tremendous thing to do. Maybe 70 people, I led off with the preamble. And that Constitution is now the shortest, oldest political document of any democracy in the world. And at the end of the day, it says nobody's in charge. So that wealth, that well-being was created collectively. The country works essentially from the bottom up. It's something to remind yourself. Next, here's a bad news slide for democracy. A crisis of confidence. 50 years ago, that wouldn't have looked like that. How can you be a democratic state under the rule of law? And by the way, Congress is now run around 9%. Article 1 of the Constitution, we talk about 3 co-equal branches of government. Article 1 deals with the preeminent branch of government, which is the Congress, or state legislatures, or county councils. That's where the ultimate legitimacy is the apportionment of money. Colin Powell would say, Barry, don't talk to me about your programs, talk to me about your budgets. Smart people fight over budgets. How can you do that if you have almost no confidence in the Congress of the United States? How can you be a democracy if you distrust the media, television news, newspapers, etc.? And on the other end, you've got the most trusted institution in American society is the armed forces. Interesting. It's a giant enterprise. It's, by the way, it's probably under-resourced for what we told it to do. It's 4.7% of GNP. But it's this huge global operation. It's in 5,000 different places around the earth. It's got, more than 2 million people in it. And you look at the active Guard Reserve, it's been over 10 years at war, and what's happening to create that, I would argue, is these teenagers that come join us for 4 years write their mom and dad and say, I'm inside this ship's company, in this squadron, in this battalion, and the NCOs and the officers I know of have created an institution where they care about my well-being. They're trying to develop me as a person. They are people of integrity, and the organization is one built around courage. So we end up with the armed forces as consistently, year after year, There's another poll I sometimes use where that trust in the armed forces is at 96%. We got to do something about this. We have a challenge with governance in the country in the coming decade. I hope that's the last one, is it? By golly, here we go, 7:25. How are we doing on time?
Very good.
Yeah. So we're going to do some things up here. The stage hands are going to shift things around. So as you're thinking about your questions, one thing that we wanted to keep in mind is that the traveling mics that are going to go around, you're going to go ahead and you're going to speak into the mic so that the audio and video are recorded for us. And when we think about leadership, we went through, basically touched on all the different dimensions of leadership, and we have a speaker tonight who can also talk about the dynamics between the different parts of the executive branch, as well as what does a nation who's been at war for 10 years do when we lose the crisis of confidence
like they're setting up the Last Supper up here or something.
And I also like to introduce tonight Dr. Sebastian Gorka, who's going to do a moderated Q&A. He's one of your adjunct faculty members. He teaches U.S. national security decision-making here in the Institute, and he's also a founding member of CENSA. And so I think we're ready for you, and I can be quiet now. So, please.
I'd prefer to stand up if we could, yeah.
Okay.
I can run for it if it goes bad.
I'll do it from the podium. So the prerogative I have is just to start the Q&A session, and I've got a couple of questions that come out of who CENSA is and why it was created by a young major back in 1998 at the Kennedy School. We wanted to promote new thought, and we wanted to break down the mafias of think tankery in this city. And what we were thinking about doing is, with the next generation, is trying to challenge old ways of thinking, but specifically in the national security arena. That's why we have the name that we do, and I'm proud to be one of the founding members of those many years ago in Cambridge. So if I may, General, I'd like to take the themes that you've given us today with regards to leadership, but put them into the context of your incredible experience with regards to national security. And I just have a few questions, and I'd like to open it up to the rest of you to ask yours. We are in the 11th year of what has been called the longest war since 1776 for the United States. You have an inestimable experience with irregular threats, whether it's countering the terrorist threat in your work in the NATO terrorism working group, whether it's dealing as the commander-in-chief of the Southern Command with the threats in Latin America. I'd like to get your response to some noises we're hearing from inside the Pentagon and elsewhere inside the Beltway in recent months, that there are senior individuals in uniform who are starting to make the noises that the last 10 years were the anomaly, that we have to get back to what they see as real war, which in many cases they describe as the first Gulf War. As the officer responsible for the left hook during the Gulf War, I'd like to ask you, do you agree with that opinion? Has the last 10 years been the anomaly, or is it what we have to prepare for in the future?
Well, you know, I shouldn't say this, it always amuses me, the defense intellectuals grinding away inside the Beltway. You know, inside the Beltway is the only place you'll ever see a guy walking down Pennsylvania Avenue holding his own hand. And so sometimes it's an echo chamber, and I don't actually think anyone ever thought that or said that. We look at the country's history over 200 years. By the way, you got to wonder why this is the case, but we've been at some state of war a good bit of that 200 years. Most of it irregular warfare. And we're actually pretty good at it, subduing the Indian population with injustice or not. Vietnam, this endless war, 58,000 killed, 303,000 wounded. By the way, that one came a cropper, not because the American people said we've shed too much blood, because the American people finally decided the government didn't know what they were doing. and they were grinding away, destroying our young people to no purpose. So I think the high-intensity combat, you get this sine wave of potential defense challenges. I had some handouts, Paul, that I left with you, and the next talk I'm giving is in, except for tomorrow night, is in Las Vegas on Chemical and Defense National Association. So our threats run a range from, when Fidel dies, I spent 7 hours with Fidel. Very interesting. I came back and debriefed the Washington community, and they said, I told them, well, he's sort of like a third delusional, not as bad as some U.S. politicians I've dealt with, but nonetheless delusional. When he dies, within a couple of years, Raul will lose it. The 45-year-olds will be in a struggle for power, and as many people as can will get on Ministry of the Interior boats and run for it. So defense scenario number one, for sure, if you're in the Coast Guard, Navy, Air Force, National Guard, we're going to ask you to deal with 250,000 to 1 million Cuban refugees sometime in the next 5 years. Count on it. Now there's one extreme, or we're going to ask you to deliver the mail, or we're going to ask you to go in there and unscrew Katrina, the most shameful meltdown of local, state, federal government responsibility in a crisis. Then you turn to the armed forces. So they're on one end. And then on the other end, and I think this is where the question comes from, to be fair to the purpose of your question, the only thing you can't do is lose the Army in Korea. My dad was up on the Yalu, 1950. He was the deputy chief of staff of the Corps, put the Advanced Corps headquarters in, was the last Jeep out. The Marines said, Colonel, don't try and go down the road. We think the Chinese have cut it. And he got through that night. I was the last person that came out until the Marine 1st Division fought their way out. So you can't ever lose high-intensity engagements. And frequently, you don't choose the battle. So if you ask me what's the number one defense responsibility of the United States, it's to prevent the proliferation of weapons of mass destruction. Nuclear, number one, and then radiological, chemical, bio. And to do that, one part we ask the armed forces, and we don't talk about it, the number one responsibility is a deterrent capability for nuclear warfare. Is it there? Is it scientifically adept? Is it modernized? Is it controlled? Is it responsive? 30 nations have treaty obligations with us that we will be their nuclear deterrent, and we're not talking about that. So there's at the far right as a defense responsibility. And then in the middle, you say, what's the worst thing I could think of for my son to get? My son's in Afghanistan as a deputy CJ3 of the Scaparati's headquarters there. What's the worst thing that can happen? We fight the North Koreans in 60 days. Might happen. Don't think it will. It's a probability. And by the way, the intel guys, a bunch of you in the room, you never want to hear what we think the enemy might do. We want to hear what are the capabilities that people have that could cause us either threat to our existential survival or embarrassment. Number one would be fighting the North Koreans. And that means the most important force on the battlefield, bar none. Here's a trick question. Somebody better get it right here. I'm going to report them to their branch. What's the most important battle tool that the U.S. Armed Forces has fighting the North Koreans? It's what? Come on, somebody got to risk it. Some Army guy at least stumbled around an answer, Huh? No, artillery. That's it, and we've broken the artillery branch completely. They can't do it in Korea today. So Ray Odierno, our new Army chief, has to rebuild that force. So I think as you look toward the future, we're very poor at discerning where the next military actions will be. By the way, one of the things we got to do is the American people are sick of us fighting. We got 53,000 killed and wounded. We spent $1 trillion. We had a flawed intervention in Iraq. It was crazy going in there with, except for the brave Brits, with no allies, no Arabs, no idea what we do once we accomplished our purpose. Then we went to Afghanistan. Rule number one of military operations of the U.S. Army is don't go anywhere you can't walk down to the sea in a U.S. Navy ship. And we're 800 miles from the water. So I think one of the things you're going to see is for 20 years to come, the American people are going to be real skeptical about Somalias and Afghanistans, et cetera, until we forget and get back in it again. So anyway, I think the real challenge is how do you develop cyber warfare, defensive and offensive capability? How do you deal with biowarfare, the craziest thing in the world, biowarfare? No nation state even remotely thinks it's a useful tool. Some of them maintain capabilities as deterrents, but nobody in his right mind thinks that's a useful tool unless you're one of the 44 terrorist organizations that our State Department says are threats to our interests. They're going to use bio on us, and we're not prepared. And you talk to the armed forces about what we're doing on bio or chemical, you get a defense plan for the Norfolk Naval installations. So what about the American people? Aren't we here to defend them? So I think that's the challenge that's coming up. High-intensity warfare, though, don't lose one. You don't get a go-around.
Thank you, General. I'll ask one more question before I hand over to the floor. You mentioned Iraq. In 2005, you wrote an opinion piece in the Wall Street Journal, and you called Iraq...
Damn! Google's a hell of a...
At the time, at the height of the insurgency, you called the Iraq intervention the right war at the right time in the right place. But in that same piece, you very heavily criticized its execution, and especially Secretary of Defense Rumsfeld, who you accused of micromanagement and an inability to recognize this war for what it was. In that op-ed, you pointed to the fact that we are trying to execute a policy of Iraqification too soon, that the Iraqi national forces are not ready for us to hand over the baton as we had attempted to do in Vietnam decades earlier. Today, do you think the same is true in Afghanistan? Are the ANP, are the Afghan National Security Forces ready to have the conflict Afghanized or not?
Boy, that is the $64,000 question, isn't it? So you look at Afghanistan, how many of you have been there? A bunch of you have. I know all the military guys have been there a bunch of times. And it's really a fascinating country. Just utterly fascinating. They're such beautiful people. Most of our soldiers really admire the hell out of them. They're fun to be around. They're great businessmen. They're great soldiers. They're great friends if they're not trying to kill you. They're good students. They may be illiterate, and they'll watch one of our engineer sergeants do something and they'll copy it. They're survivors. And by the way, Afghanistan's gone from the most cruel, chaotic place on the face of the earth at intervention. We started, the tribes had been destroyed, the clans, the families. There weren't two bricks, one sitting on top of another in Afghanistan when we went in with the agency and 300 special ops guys. Now you fly around the country, you got road networks and women's clinics and universities and TV stations and newspapers and a parliament. You can go into the parliament and there's, some 70-year-old warlord with cartridge belts and talking to a 35-year-old female with her PhD from the Sorbonne. It's amazing how far that's come. But you still got a tribal society, 40,000 villages. It's an internal ethnic civil war between the Pashtun, the Hazars, the Uzbeks, the Tajiks, etc. And now, Mr. Obama, who's a remarkable, talented leader, looked at the polling data, and the American people, 2/3 of them, don't want to continue Afghanistan. And by the way, one of the things that we don't face up to, if I'm in and out of the White House, first thing I'll say is, do you know that? And I remember at the height of the Iraq War, I told my friend Steve Hadley and a small group of NSCs that we're losing a battalion a month in Iraq. I said, where in the hell did you get that? We're losing 700 killed and wounded a month in Afghanistan. It's a $10 billion a month burn rate. American people aren't going to sustain it. It's over. So Obama, I think, for political reasons, in the best sense of the term, said we're out by 2014, except for unspecified stay behind. When you look at the current state of affairs, can the Afghan army establish security presence in Afghanistan post-2014? No, of course not. It's going to fragment. We recruit very few Pashtun from the south. We even lie to ourselves about it. And so, by and large, that army, which is the best army in the history of Afghanistan, reasonably effective, fights, doesn't have air power, doesn't have intel, doesn't have a medical system, doesn't, on and on, but it's a decent army. The national police are a flippin' disaster. They're drug-dazed thieves. It's much easier to create an infantry battalion than it is a police force. Immensely easier. You can put together an infantry battalion. If I took 10 of you in a room and you issued us 800 American 20-year-olds, 90 days later we'd be able to fight. But if you try and do a police force, that's the business of a generation. So the Afghan police are not going to be ready in 2014. And then we got the Karzai government, and I don't know I've had a couple of sessions with Karzai, educated, sensitive, he actually cares when people suffer, but he has started to unravel. He's completely unraveling political support in this country for the war. Just bizarre behavior. You'd have to say if you were on a distant planet listening objectively, this can't work. Now, one of my heroes, the commander of the Ranger Regiment, said, the other side of the question is, if the Taliban thought about it, sometime between now and the U.S. election, they'd negotiate a total ceasefire. And there's a history of that. They said, we're going to stop fighting. Quetta Shura is a big meeting, and they issue an edict, and they tell their guys, stop fighting. Haqqani Network could be bought off. Give them $1 billion to stop fighting for 32 days. Give them a second billion, maybe be cheaper than fighting them. So it's possible we'll negotiate an interregnum on this war, particularly in the next 18 months. I hope that's the outcome, because I don't see us, I cannot imagine that we can influence the sanctuary in Baluchistan. I mean, the Pak army doesn't have any control of what goes in downtown Quetta, for God's sakes. Pakistan's 4 separate nations, one weak overarching state. Nobody in the region wants to see a powerful democratic Afghanistan. Nobody inside the country wants to see a central government that's actually in charge of the provinces. I think we're in trouble in Afghanistan, but I can't imagine what a better option is. You know, we're going to play this hand out and see what happens.
Thank you, General. I'd like to open the questions. Just please identify yourself. Yes, go ahead.
What time are we over?
And wait for the mic.
8:50. 10 minutes.
Hello? Okay. General, it's an honor. My name is Gaurav Tanwar. I'm a student here at GPPI. I'd like to ask about a specific point you made about the Haqqani network. Now, you said, maybe we can buy them off, give them $1 billion for 32 days. Do you honestly think that the Haqqanis can be bought off? I mean, they've been fighting in this region for 40 plus years. They know how to make a profit from it, and ideologically, they're stronger with the other terrorist organizations in the region when they don't fight.
I don't know. I really don't. I think you can buy almost anything in that part of the world in the short term. So like American politics in the 30s, you can buy them, but will they stay bought? I think the most effective thing we're doing right now in Afghanistan is killing the leadership of the Taliban and the Haqqani network. And it is worth your life. You get a lifespan of 72 hours. Or JSOC comes in at 2 o'clock in the morning, and some flippin' dog with titanium teeth rips your groin off, and they haul you off to... So we're taking out the leadership. It's not a lot of fun being a Taliban operative. They get a lot of money. We see them coming out of Sanctuary now. We're in REI camping gear, and commercially available encrypted telecommunications and shiny new sniper rifles. But it's not a lot of fun fighting in Afghanistan against us. But we know when Mr. Obama communicated a political reality to the American people, trust me, I'm going to wind this thing up. He talked to the Karzai government, the Pakistani government, the Haqqani network, and everybody said, what does this mean? These guys are leaving. And now there's a rush for the door by our allies. They are gone. Canadians are gone. The Danes are gone. You know, people are headed for the door. The Brits are going to leave. And I think by American politics is almost the determining factor right now on how this thing plays out. And I don't say that in a good sense either. You know, Biden, who's, you know, I've had a lot of respect for Vice President. As a senator, he's a big help to me. He posed an intellectual alternative, which was don't fight an internal counterinsurgency, go for de minimis presence, you know, hold Bagram Airfield and the embassy and do trainers and special ops, and that was intellectually an option. Most of us, I'm one of them, thinks that immediately unravels on you, that it actually won't work. The JSOC can't operate if there aren't U.S. brigades 20 kilometers from your target. So I don't think Obama had much of an option. He went and did this very, I think it was bad political theater, send Stan McChrystal in country doing reanalysis of what we're doing here. What do you think the generals are going to say? Say, sure, you know, this thing's starting to go down the tube on us. We need more resources. Here's the real alternative, too. Could we actually create a stable political, economic, cultural system of Afghanistan? Of course we could. It's child's play. The problem is you have to stay for 25 years, and you probably have to fight for 10 of them. But if we told everyone in the region, we're not leaving, this is it, we're committed, could the U.S. Armed Forces absorb 700 killed and wounded a month? Of course we could. You know, for God's sakes, 4.7% of GNP, it's the lowest percent of resources to national defense in any war in our history. It's that big. Our budgetary problems are entitlement. Medicare, Medicaid, Social Security, military retirement. So we could actually hang on until my granddaughter's a division commander in Afghanistan, and we'd probably fly in and out of there, and it'd be operating reasonably effectively. We've seen massive changes in other societies. The Japanese, one of the most impressive societies on the face of the earth. But those aren't our options. So, again, I personally am really concerned about how this plays out. One of the reasons is, you know, I tell people I've been married to this lass for 47 years, and I came out of 3 tours in combat as a company-grade officer where my wife despised U.S. politicians, reporters, and generals, and she changed her mind about any of them in the interim. And so one of my sensitivities, I don't want to see this generation of the military in 2016 saying, you people bled us dry, we gave you our all, and you walked away from it. Remember the McNamara book? Unbelievable. Said he figured it out, we were going to lose on year 3 of the war. And we kept grinding away for another 6 years. What other thoughts you got?
Over here? Yep.
Being a hand mic person is a very responsible position, by the way.
I'm Brandon Balkine. I'm at the Public Policy Institute here. And my question is about defense cuts. It seems that we're going to be forced to make cuts, whether or not they're prudent. And one of those areas that will be most likely compensation for the military and for defense workers. My question is relating to your presentation tonight. What's a good strategy to look at this sort of reform while maintaining the morale of the force?
Well, first of all, I don't think there's going to be major cuts in defense. I don't believe it. I think it's nonsense. We're going to come out of Afghanistan and Iraq. So the burn rate, right now we're taking our modernization money and we're spending it on wounded soldiers, and 5.56 ammunition and fuel. So I think we're going to end the two wars in the coming 3 to 5 years. Then I think what I'd hope would happen is we'd actually select a defense strategy, and out of that sort out the technology, the organizational structures, the doctrine to implement the strategy, and then we figured out how much would it cost to do this where there's a guarantee it'll work. That's what we ought to do instead of talking about the budgets. By the way, some of the stupidest things I've seen are talking about changing the military retirement system in the middle of a war. What a group of idiots. It's not going to affect the senior guys. It's going to affect the staff sergeants of the Army, the captains of the Marine Corps, who are on, we just had a big dinner I was speaker at in Colorado Springs, and told a couple of you, we had a veteran of each war stand up there, and we actually had a World War II vet, a 16-year-old boy, and he lied his way into the 82nd Airborne, 4 combat jumps in World War II. Magnificent. The Iraq-Afghanistan vet was a Special Forces Master Sergeant with 2 Purple Hearts and 10 combat deployments. So, changing the rules of the game on compensation in the middle of the struggle is asinine. And by the way, they're not going to change compensation dramatically in the armed forces anyway. I think what we ought to do, by the way, there are gigantic structural issues that ought to get debated. There really are. I mean, how much nuclear force do you need? Nuclear power, if you made it out of sheer gold, it would be cheaper. It's so expensive to maintain nuclear deterrence. Putting a pound on target with a Navy carrier battle group is more expensive than putting a pound on the surface of the moon. It's such an expensive, multi-billion-dollar exercise. So all these systems ought to get looked at. And by the way, I don't think you need a land-ground combat force at step 1 to fight the Chinese if they invade Taiwan. There's a whole bunch of things you ought to say. Now we're not going to do that. I don't think we've had an intelligent debate on defense. It's not going to happen between now and the election. Hopefully, when the next administration takes power, Obama or Mitt Romney, there'll be such a discussion. But we need to decide on our defense strategy. That's the challenge. Some of this short-term stuff, selling off, excuse me, federal land holdings in the middle of a housing bust. Now, there's a smart way to pay for short-term costs. Well, this whole system over here wouldn't withstand scrutiny by some guy running a business with 100 employees. Very discouraging. Yes, sir.
Last question here, please.
Sir, your chart that showed the confidence in public institutions with the military at the top and the politicians at the bottom, why then don't we see a flow of leadership from the military into politics?
Well, I think you are going to see that, by the way. I think this generation of soldiers are going to run for office. Soldiers, take that as generic, are going to run for public office. They're going to show up as county executives. One of the best things that's happened in American politics, bar none, is the steady recruitment of women to go into political life. That's changed things for the better enormously at lower levels. And I think we are going to see, there's a huge disgust with both political parties. By the way, it's too bad because the two-party system has served us well, as opposed to a parliamentary system where you've got fragmented 30 parties. And we've done pretty well having 2 parties, one the antithesis to the other. But I spent a lot of time sitting around green rooms talking to very bright political analysts. And one of them, a Democratic strategist, says, Obama's the last president from the 2 major parties. Then after this election, next time it'll be a third-party candidate that'll win. And I think what you're seeing is a steady erosion of the number of people who will say, I'm a Democrat or Republican, growing numbers of independents, decreasing sense of commitment to a political party. It makes me uneasy because most of our third-party movements historically have been either brief shot of the reformers who don't stay in office or they're fringe candidates. But I think what we're going to need to see is pragmatic, common sense women and men emerge and run for political office. And I hope this generation, by the way, just sort of good closing point. You know, in business, we're always talking about this generation and, you know, what are they up to, and they don't work hard enough, and they don't treat us with respect. That's sort of traditional for guys looking down at the organization. And I always say, well, I'm in and out of the war zone all the time, and we look at these guys and say, this is the best generation we ever had in uniform, bar none. Sheer courage, commitment, talent, independent thought, they're remarkable. So, you know, sort of to close out the evening, I've got a lot of confidence looking forward. I've got the next lecture I'm giving, I'm doing a snapshot of the economy. You know, we're still the largest manufacturing nation on the face of the earth, the biggest producer of agricultural exports, have the most gigantic free economic zone, NAFTA, on the face of the earth. Still produce 25% of the world's high technology, pharmaceuticals, aviation, et cetera. Still have this huge economy. I go up and talk to the Russian generals course, coming up again here in another month, and I always change one of my slides. It shows relative GDPs, and one of them says, Texas GDP equals Russian GDP. And I always take that off. I don't know who will be more offended, the Texans or the Russians. But I mean, we have to remind ourselves periodically, the basis is still immense. But we got these political challenges. And by the way, some of them intellectually aren't very hard to figure out. You know, Social Security, come on. I grab my engineer friend here and give him 5 work days to produce a white paper, and he'll tell you how to fix Social Security. There's only 3 variables. You pay more or less, get it earlier or later, or, you know, broaden the participation less or more. That's it. But you have to seize upon a high option, a middle, a lower, and then you have to coalesce around it, and then it takes you 15 years to get there. Our problem is we can't coalesce around options. And so I don't believe 80% of the American people are common sense. By the way, that Congress isn't, the leadership I think is suspect, but most of the congressmen I run into are pretty common sense people. So we got a leadership governance problem. We will work our way out of it. By the way, these guys have paid a lot more attention to me than my family does, I'll tell you that. I'm going to sort of end with a standard.
Thank you, General. Rob?
Well, I get my final story. It's one of my favorite stories. Too quick. I'm on NBC periodically on TV, and my substantive feedback loop over my cell phone are my 2 grown daughters. And they'll call me with substantive feedback when I'm off air and say, you know, Dad, that was great makeup, great lighting, great tie, that kind of substantive feedback that I so value. And several years ago, true story, I'd been on all day long, like 5 or 6 times. I get off, it's 8 o'clock at night, I was in Secaucus, New Jersey. My oldest daughter calls and said, Dad, both of us girls thought that was an incredibly good interview. I said, well, that's great, I've been on all day, which one was it? We don't know, we always turn the sound off. And on that note, have a good night. Thanks very much.
So after the wonderful discussion we had tonight, I'm afraid that the tweet we're going to see is something about Titanian teeth and Harkani groins. So, but we'll take that publicity because you heard it here. So we did have, sir, for you Madam, it's a Sensa pen. And we're assuming you still write, and we're looking forward to maybe having you join us on Sensa blog in the near term. So thank you very much, sir.
Thanks very much. Yeah, that's beautiful.
And Scott, do you want to come up and say a little bit? Or are you, Scott?
So very quickly, you know, actually, and I'm a board member and a founding member of Sensa, and they fly me in every once in a while because I'm the only one in the room that has no military service. Maybe there's 2. And actually, I want to bring that out. I'm a partner in a big international law firm, and I run the Boston office. And these comments were incredibly, incredibly helpful to me and the 50 people that I supervise. This is what we do. That's it. You know, there's no reason to go into any history. There's no reason to go into any background. There's no reason to go into this book we wrote because this is what we do. We put you in a room with people like the General, you get to ask questions. It's amazing. And we do that not only through these speaker series, through these publications, but really through the relationships that we've created over the last 11 years and that we'll continue to create as we go forward. Cocktails and food in the back. Thank you all for coming. We really appreciate it. And please, please sign up. Sheet is on your seat, okay? Thank you. Appreciate it.
Run of folks. Right.
Oh, Todd. No, I don't talk about it. Yeah.
Want my money?
I'm just trying to run through the names that I know. My dad's
because I work on the joint staff for the director of the joint staff operations center. What do you
Please feel free. There's plenty of food. There's plenty of alcohol and other things, but there's also plenty of literature about Sensa, what it is, what the organization is, what we do. It was founded by a guy who was just like a young captain, Major Mike Fenzel, back in the day. It's going on, what, 13, 14?
11 years.
What's that?
11 years.
11 years? Okay.
Yeah.
11 years ago, and it was to bring mid-career professionals together. What we do here in the Washington, D.C. chapter, we try to have a number of great events, like have already been mentioned. We do a monthly dinner series, usually in Old Town. If you've ever been to the 219 restaurant, it's a fabulous setting. We go out in the Jefferson Room, and what's good about that is it's a quiet, intimate setting, no more than 40 people tops. The next big speaker we're going to have on Wednesday, January 11th, will be Brent Scowcroft. That's probably going to be a members-only dinner. We'll close it to the membership and then open it up at the end if there are seats available. So I would like to encourage you all to join. Not anybody can just join the organization. There is a review process, but for the most part, a CV and a writing sample. And if you've been through graduate school, curriculum vitae. You know, just it's your resume. So sorry.
You work in the petting.
Yeah, right. So it's your a resume and a writing sample will, so we just want to make sure that it's people who contribute to the ongoing policy debate. The good thing about Sensa, it gives a chance for mid-career professionals to engage senior policy professionals like General McCaffrey, like General Scowcroft, like Undersecretary Flournoy and Vickers. Many of our events are filmed, as this was tonight, will be posted on our website for anybody to download. Some of the people who are currently in government like to have them off the record, where Chatham House rules apply, which just allows more of a free flow of information between the emerging generation of national security leaders with those who are currently setting policy, who are engaging policy. We are all volunteers. Nobody in this organization is paid for anything, and so we all come out and do this because we believe in it. And same with our guest speakers. We haven't paid any guest speakers an honorarium. They just like to come out because of the audience that we provide. We also do national security teleconferences, many of them very high level with you know, 2- and 3-star generals who are downrange, or people who are engaged in what's going on in Afghanistan. We've done Pentagon luncheons. Colin Agee, who's a member of Sensa, has agreed to do a luncheon here. It's just a chance for those of us to get away, but it's at Pentagon City, which is easily parkable and metroable, you know, for those who are working elsewhere in the Pentagon. Colin was the Deputy G2, Deputy Chief of Intel in Iraq, and he's great to share some of his experiences with us there. So definitely take some literature, fill out the cards, and lastly, like I said, Sensa is you. It's the membership, and so unlike you know, some of the more senior organizations like the Council of Foreign Relations, if a member of Sensa, you know, wants to drive the organization in a direction, start a blog, start a collaboration, start a publication. That's one thing we do. There are examples of our books. About every year or every other year, we'll put out a hardbound book where each chapter is contributed by members of the organization. And so it's a really good chance to get your name, you know, take research that you've done and get it in print. And then it goes out to, you know, into the world. We had book launch events at the National Defense University and at the National Press Club this year on our most recent volume, which is Hybrid Warfare. There we go. They're always based on a theme, whether it was Crossroads Africa the time before, on countering insurgency and promoting democracy. And so I encourage you to check out the website, check out our publications, and check out the organization. I'd love to see all of you at the Scowcroft event if we could. Thanks. Oh, and by the way, last thing, these series, the Leadership Lecture Series, it's something we started last year. Last year was our first at Johns Hopkins with Stan McChrystal in his first public speech after his retirement. And but next semester we've got General Jim Jones has agreed to speak here. He's President Obama's first national security advisor, former SACEUR, former Commandant of the Marine Corps, and a Georgetown alum. So that should be good. Sign up if you want to learn more about it. Yes.
Jim